to the latest edition of the Claw's Corner. Today's guest is an independent creator, researcher, author, podcaster, and investigator in numerous aspects of the paranormal. He has been fascinated by all things paranormal, beginning with the UFO Encounter at the age of 4. His books include UFOs over Maine, Abducted New England, Otherworldly Encounters, Evidence of UFO Sightings and Abductions, and Granite Skies. You can listen to his podcast, I Want to Believe. It's a podcast where monsters are real and UFOs land. A podcast where you say to yourself, I want to believe. If you are a non-believer before, you definitely will not be by the end of this episode. Please welcome Nomar Slevik to the Claw's Corner. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me. That's quite the intro. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being on the show. And I met you several years ago at one of your speeches, and it was great. I am a huge fan of the paranormal. I am a believer. And I love the fact about you, we'll get right into it, is that you believe, but you also don't believe everything. You know that sometimes there's explanations for some things, so not everything's like, oh my God, that must be a ghost. That's definitely a UFO. You're like, let me look a little bit deeper into this. Let me investigate this. And that's what I found most interesting about you, because I've gone to a lot of different things where, yes, everything is real. Everything exists. And you're like, well, there might be an explanation to this, but that makes it more interesting because when you do find something real, you're like, all right, this guy's trustworthy.
Well, I appreciate that. And yeah, that certainly has evolved over the years. When I was much younger, every bump in the night was a monster or a ghost or something. But as you get older and reason and rationality hopefully take over, there certainly could be other explanations. But it's exactly what you said. When you've searched or investigated for those other potential possibilities, and you're still left with not being sure what actually happened, you can't explain it, that's where it gets really fascinating for me.
Yeah. I mean, like that light in the sky that's moving at a rapid speed, you're like, maybe that's, a drone, maybe that's a satellite. And then if you rule those out, like, all right, that's exactly what it is, an unidentified flying object. And then you delve deeper into your research, which I'm going to get into, because you wrote several books, but Granite Skies is the last one I read. And I want to talk about the case of Mike Stevens and some other things you wrote in the book. But before we do that, I mentioned in the intro, you've been interested in the paranormal since the age of 4 when you saw a UFO. Tell me about that.
Yeah, sure. It's kind of like I still have the same memory of it, and it's going to sound a little weird, but I was fast asleep. I was living up in Fort Kent, Maine, which is right at the tip of Maine. You can throw a rock and hit Canada. I actually used to get my haircuts in Canada. That's how close we were to it. And I was sleeping one night, and a loud noise or a loud bang or something woke me up. And I'm just laying there, my eyes are kind of darting around for some sort of reason for being woken up. And I start to hear like the pitter patter of rain hitting my windows. And I can see the sky starting to light up a little bit. And I was like, oh, it's a thunder and lightning storm. So that must have been thunder. So like I kneel up on the windowsill to watch the thunder and lightning. And after just a moment or two, there was this really obscene lightning bolt. Like if I were to ask you to draw a lightning bolt, you would draw this jagged yellow line, or it kind of looks like the charging indicator on your smartphone, just the universal sign for a lightning bolt. That's how we still remember it, but it was stuck in a cloud. And there was electricity coming off of it, and there were booms associated with it. And then I don't really know what happened. I guess I fell back asleep. I wake up the next morning, I go to the bathroom, and when I'm done, I'm walking back towards my room, and you can see out my bedroom windows as I'm walking to my room, and the lightning bolt is still there. And it just didn't make sense. So I ran downstairs to get my dad, brought him upstairs to show him, and the lightning bolt was gone. So I was trying to explain to him that it was thunder and lightning last night, and a lightning bolt got stuck in the cloud, and he was just, doing the typical dad adult thing when a kid is trying to tell you something crazy. He's like, yeah. But I think I was like really insistent, or maybe I started to get more upset than usual. So he kind of like put his hands on my shoulders and got on my level, like he knelt down, and he's like, it didn't even rain last night. Like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Huh.
So a couple weeks later, I was woken up again in the middle of the night, but this time it was by my mother. And she brought me downstairs, and my sister was getting her like winter coat on and ski pants and all that stuff. And my mom was trying to, like, shove boots onto me. And I'm like, what's happening? And my dad just kind of scoops me up and takes me outside to show us the northern lights. It's the only time in my life I've ever seen them. I can still remember it like it was yesterday.
Yeah.
Gorgeous. Lots of greens, I remember. And those two instances or incidents happening so close together just taught me at such a young age that weird stuff happens in the sky, so I should probably pay attention. And that was kind of like the catalyst of looking up and having a sense of wonderment looking at the sky. But it wasn't until I was 12, 13 or so, I was thinking back on that lightning bolt, and that's just kind of how I've always thought of it. But around 12 or 13, I think that's when I realized I'm pretty sure that was a UFO. Like, I don't know what else that could have been.
Yeah. You also had another experience at Mount Desert Narrows.
Yeah, that was an interesting one. I was in high school at that point, and at Mount Desert Narrows, there's a shore path, and it's nothing pretty, just a gravel path that sits right on the water. When it's high tide and the waves are crashing, you're going to get a little bit wet if you're walking that shore path. And I was hanging out with a buddy, and we saw this really bright light on the water on the Narrows. And I was like, what the hell is that? But we're seeing it from, I don't know, less than a half a mile away, because we're on the street driving and we're looking down towards the water. Well, the way that Bar Harbor is set up, to get a view of the water, you've got to go down and drive on the street that the water is on, or you got to get on the shore path or something. But other than that, it's just, the water is blocked by just businesses and houses and, things like that. So as we're driving along, kind of like in between the alleys of, every business and house, we're seeing this bright thing floating on the water, and it looks kind of big. And I'm like, dude, what the hell is that? And at this point, I'm like 16, 17 years old, and I'm like really into the paranormal at this point. I've taken out a lot of books and watching a lot of shows and the unsolved mysteries, all that good stuff. So I'm really into the paranormal at this point, and my buddy could really care less, but he's with me and maybe getting caught up in the excitement a little bit. And so he's like, well, I don't really know what that is. I mean, it's probably just a boat. I mean, obviously, but the thing is, with a boat, you have a hull, and there's not typically lights that go all the way down to the water, on a boat, especially along the entirety of the hull. Maybe there might be one down here or up here, whatever. But these were like bars of light, just from this top point all the way down to the water. And I was like, we got to get a closer look at it. So there's this road called Albert Meadow, and it goes to this little park area. I forget the name of the park now. And on the other side of this park is the shore path. So we parked down at Albert Meadow, and we made our way down to the shore path, and we just stood there and waited for this thing that was floating very slowly to pass through. And sure enough, it did. And what we saw was like this dome shape thing, like half a ball, really. That's the shape of it in my head. And there were rows of lights going from the tippy top of it all the way to the water, and it just floated by us slowly. And there was no sound other than a little bit of water movement, but that could have been waves as well. And we're both standing there looking at it. I don't remember if there's other people around, but we're both looking at it, and we're like, it's got to be a cruise ship, because Bar Harbor just gets tons of cruise ships in during the summer. And we're like, it's got to be a cruise ship, but we're not seeing any of the normal boat stuff, but our minds just weren't computing it. So we watched it float out of sight, and my buddy wanted to get home or something, or maybe he was a little freaked out. So we just got got back in my car. I dropped him off. I went home and I wrote down the whole experience, which is basically what I just told you. But it was certainly weird. I still don't know what to make of it. I mean, it totally could have been a boat. I don't know.
You never know. See, my interest begins. I'm 52 years old right now. So when the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out in 1977, I was 9 years old. It might have been around that time, a little bit later. My father was very much into it. So he would just, every year he had a new sports car, TR4, TR7, Mazda RX-7. So he always wanted to take my brothers and I for rides at night. And we just sit there in the middle of nowhere, just waiting for the UFOs to come. So I was always interested. I remember reading books in the 70s backed by J. Allen Hynek, worked with Project Blue Book. What's your opinion on him? Do you think he was covering up things for the government, or do you think that he was truthful, trying to find out what UFOs actually were?
I love Hynek. He's like the godfather of ufology, if you will, or really more sweetly the father of ufology.
Yeah.
I think he was hired by the government to discredit UFOs. And once he got in there, I think he saw that, yeah, a lot of this could be other things, especially when he was truly investigating, or people on his team were truly investigating, and they were coming up with alternative explanations. But he looked at so many cases that at one point, it was kind of like what we were talking about earlier. There were no other explanations left other than something otherworldly of some sort. I mean, extraterrestrial, I don't know. But he saw that in too many cases that he couldn't dismiss, that he had to step onto the other side of the whole belief system and start investigating UFOs as scientific fact as opposed to scientific fiction, So I guess that's my little ramble on Hynek.
No, I agree with you 100%. I am a huge Dr. J. Allen Hynek fan, and he was how I got into UFOs. I started reading his books, and that's how I became interested in, also, with going on nighttime drives with my father in the sports car, looking up in the skies. Now I want to talk about the Exeter UFO Festival. What is that?
It's a festival that's held every year. I believe this year would have been the 10th year, I think. Although they had to cancel this year because of COVID. But it's a festival that's held in Exeter, New Hampshire, and it's a UFO-themed festival that marks the anniversary of a UFO event that happened in Exeter, New Hampshire. It technically happened in Kensington, New Hampshire, but Exeter is just a hair over the line of Kensington, and Exeter is a much bigger town that actually has a police station, and where Kensington does not. And this UFO encounter happened back in the 1960s. And it happened when this gentleman was walking along the road one night. He was actually hitchhiking and walking home. And while he was doing that, he saw this crazy looking UFO with red lights. And it came out of the woods and floated fairly close to him. I mean, it was still kind of treetop level, but it scared him very much, and he tried to evade it, and it seemed to him that it was almost trying to follow him or trying to interact with him in some way. He ran to this farmhouse that was close by, which they take you on a trolley tour during the festival, that you can see the farmhouse and where all this happened. And he banged on the door, and nobody was home, or nobody answered the door. But he did notice that at this farm, the animals were in an agitated state while this UFO was present. And after a while, the UFO, I believe, kind of ducked behind the trees. He ran out to the street and he waved down a car. And it was this man and woman. And there's some speculation if that man and woman were actually having an affair, which is why their names never actually came forward. Which is kind of an interesting side note there. Anyway, they pick him up and he explains to them what happened. So they take him to the police station. That's where he wants to go. He goes to the police station. He explains to the officer there what happened. And he radios to a police officer to come in and hear this guy's story. So the guy comes in, hears the story, and decides that he's going to take the kid and go back out to see if they can figure out what it was. Well, while they're there, the UFO shows up again. And the officer is jaw dropped. So he radios another police officer. a second police officer shows up. He sees the UFO. He's jaw dropped. One of the officers actually pulls their gun and is aiming it at the UFO. After a brief moment, he's like, well, "What the hell am I doing?" And holsters the weapon.
Yeah.
And so, these two police officers and this young kid had this crazy UFO experience, in Exeter, well, technically Kensington. And during the aftermath of that, the police really wanted to try to figure out what this was. So they did do some inquiries to the Air Force, and they got an initial reply fairly quickly that they were mistaking like Jupiter or some sort of weather inversion type of thing. And they're like, no, that's not what happened at all. So they were pretty upset about it. So they got together with this other UFO investigator, and they started compiling like their own report on what happened, and it eventually turned into a book and all this great stuff. But during that whole process, while they were writing the book, they did get another reply from the Air Force that their case has gone into an unknown status, as opposed to this is what you saw and just forget about it. They basically admitting without admitting that, hey, we're not really sure what you saw. um, but it's a great story. That was a very, very brief rundown of it. But because of that encounter 10 years ago or so, a man named Dean Merchant, who is the loveliest man, and his wife started the Exeter UFO Festival, which is actually a charity event for the area Kiwanis Club for kids. And, so they raise money for children with this festival, and they get speakers from all around the country. The Richard Dolans, Travis Waltons, Stanton Friedman when he was still around. Rest in peace to Stanton. So it's become a pretty big event in the Northeast, which is pretty cool.
Hoping next year things will be back to normal and I'll be able to take care of them. I'll be able to go down there and watch it or see it in person, because I did want to go last year and I couldn't make it because I was busy, and I was all ready for this year. But hopefully next year, post-COVID, I'm hoping we'll be back to normal. Tell me about Norman Muscarello.
Well, that's the kid from the
That is him.
Exeter. Yep, that's
Okay.
him. Yeah.
And what year was this?
Geez, 61 or 65. I think it might be 65 because Betty and Barney Hill were 61. So I think Exeter was 65. I think. Yeah, I don't have the book in front of me. My bad, but.
Well, no, that's no problem. That was a perfect segue what I wanted to talk about next. Another New Hampshire couple, Betty and Barney Hill.
Yeah.
That is such an intriguing and interesting case. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, well, Betty and Barney Hill, what's really intriguing about their case, well, for listeners who don't know, Betty and Barney Hill reportedly claimed that they were abducted by aliens and taken aboard a UFO, and they were experimented on and then returned. So that's basically the very super brief gist of that story. But what makes their story very interesting is that their abduction story was one of the first paranormal stories, maybe besides Bigfoot in '58, whenever that Patty film, '57 maybe, the Gimlin Bigfoot video was released. This was one of the first like paranormal stories that like went viral for its time. Like it got national coverage. And the more interesting fact is that this is kind of like the architect of how an abduction scenario has been reported really like ever since the Betty and Barney Hill incident. So they were taken aboard a craft, they were sedated in some state, they were laid on examination tables, and samples were taken from them, experiments were done upon them, they interacted with the aliens via telepathy, and that sort of archetype has kind of been the basis for abduction scenarios going forward. But to have such a vivid encounter recalled by these two, and to have it really be the first one, like nothing to go off of, and we've seen since that so many of these abduction scenarios are very similar to theirs, strikes a lot of credibility for their claims, that all these thousands of others abductees are having very similar experiences as the Hills, but they were the originators of that archetype, if you will.
Barney was a little bit more afraid of the aliens than Betty was.
Yeah, he definitely was. He was, first of all, he was dismissive of the lights in the sky to begin with. It took a bit of coaxing for him to really pay attention. But once he stopped the car and actually looked at what was happening, he understood that something out of the ordinary was happening. And during his abduction, he remembers keeping his eyes closed most of the time. He didn't want to look at who was taking him. They were speaking to him telepathically, but they were comforting. They were like, we're not going to hurt you. Like, it's going to be okay. That type of stuff. But he was pretty scared. In the aftermath for Barney, he just had a hard time dealing or coping or processing what happened to him. So he ended up seeing a therapist for a little while to try to help him get through some of this, and he came out on the other side of it after a while. The following 5 or 10 years, he finally came out on the other side of it pretty good. And I really think it helped that he and Betty went around speaking about their encounters, and we're finding A, that people believed them, and B, that other people had similar encounters and could relate to them. He could relate to those other abductees, which is pretty cool and good for him. I think good for his mind, good for his soul.
I love this story because Betty was a little bit more aggressive. She supposedly met the leader on the ship,
Yeah.
and then she said, I want to bring home proof. What was that proof?
She asked, or really she asked for anything. So the leader supposedly said, well, look around, and, see what you want. So she's, supposedly looking around this UFO and finds this book, a rather large book she described. And the leader is like, okay, you want that? Open it up. Can you read any of it? And she opened it up and she could not. But she was really adamant. She's like, just no one's going to believe me. Like, please let me take this. So the leader said, sure, take it. And she was ecstatic that she could take that and that they were going to have proof. And, this was going to change the world.
Yeah.
And just before they were going to bring Betty and Barney back, the leader asked for the book back. And Betty was upset. She's like, why? And he's like, well, I've talked to my other colleagues, which would be the other aliens. And the other aliens were like, no, you can't give her the book. And, so who knows what was in this book. But Betty was resistant, but the leader said, you can't leave with it, And so she
So as what you were talking about before we were interrupted, we said that Betty was speaking to the leader and she wanted the book for proof. And then he talked to his colleagues and they're like, no, you don't get any book. I changed my mind. And I thought it was funny because as I was reading your book, it seemed very similar to the Twilight Zone episode, The Served Man, where throughout the whole episode, no, we got to feed you. We got to make you happy so we can take you to our planet. At the end of the episode, don't go on the ship. We realized we decoded it. It's a cookbook. So I thought I was reading that. That's what I was thinking of. Maybe Betty had the cookbook. That would have been the aliens' real reason for coming to Earth.
They're like, no, you can't give her the cookbook, you idiot. That would have been funny. I wish I wrote that parallel in the book. But anyway, so Betty had to give up this book for her proof to show people that that this had actually happened to her and her husband. But it turns out she actually had some proof in her head. And what I mean by that is during their discussion, her and the alien leader, he actually showed her this holographic image of that alien species place in the universe, and where they traveled, and saw other planets and stars, and there were actually routes that were outlined in this star map, and there were ones with dotted lines and solid lines, and some were trade routes, and some were just actual routes that they took for exploration. And this really uh, hit home with Betty, and it was such an amazing encounter that she reluctant, or without knowing, remembered this star map and ended up drawing it out on a piece of paper. And when this first star map came out, a lot of people uh, weren't very receptive to it, because some of the points, or some of the star areas, were of places that actually haven't been discovered yet at that time, back in the late 60s or early 70s. And it wasn't until quite a while later that her star map, when put against this area of the galaxy, and new discoveries that had happened since her drawing of that map, actually lines up with this, with these constellations and stars that are out there, which lends just a ton of credibility to her actually witnessing this holographic image aboard a UFO, which seems ridiculous, but to be able to draw that star map back in the mid late 60s, really really crazy.
Yeah. Well, the fact that she drew stars that people didn't even know existed until we had the technology years later, that's pretty credible to me.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think the fact that there are going to be some people that want their 10 seconds of fame or 10 minutes of fame, and they're going to make up stories just to be on the news. But there's so many people that are credible, such as Air Force pilots, Navy pilots, military, that say, I don't know, something was tailing my wing over there, I don't know what that was.
Hmm.
So there's a lot more credible people out there coming out, which I love, saying, yeah, we're not alone. And I think Betty and Barney Hill is such a great example of that.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I think they're one of the few well-known, credible cases of alien abduction and intervention. Really fascinating. And when I talk to people, just to kind of reiterate, like, where I come from, I don't believe everything that everybody tells me. I can bring it down in percentage points. Like 75% of the people I talk to, I believe that they believe uh, what happened to them, and that's good enough for me. Like, I want to share that story. They're genuine. They're having a hard time or a great time with it. Regardless, there's some sort of believability that I've snatched onto, that I believe their story is compelling, and I want to know it, and I want to share it, and I want to document it. And I would say about 15% of the time, people are just straight up lying to me. I'm very kind. I'm very open-minded, but I just walk away after the interview. And then I'd say 10% of the time is when I'm left with just absolute confusion, and believe that some sort of otherworldly event took place. I don't know what it could be. I don't know if it's aliens, but something out of the ordinary happened. And again, that's only about 10% of the time. But that kind of takes me to this other part of ufology, which is the acronym UFO has just become synonymous with extraterrestrial. And the way I come at it, and the way I write about it, is that UFO is just that, an unidentified flying object. And even with all these Navy encounters that are coming forward now, they have started using a different acronym, UAP, as opposed to UFO, to try to get away from that extraterrestrial stigma. And the UAP is unidentified aerial phenomenon, and obviously that still is very similar to unidentified flying object, but the way that has become synonymous, I actually think it makes a whole lot of sense to switch over to UAP, and to try to see those types of encounters through a different lens. I think that's a really great way to go about it.
I think it's a great way, but I think it's also sad that there's a stigma to it. People shouldn't
Yeah,
be
yeah, yeah,
embarrassed to come out and say, I saw something that I don't know what it is. I don't think it was from this earth, but honestly, it's unidentified. They shouldn't be
yeah.
ashamed to tell people. But I think there are a lot of people that are maybe afraid if they tell their story, they're going to be made fun of, and they're like, I'd rather just be quiet. So we were talking about the military seeing things. In your opinion, do you think that the military is working with the aliens? Like,
I have no idea.
yeah. Well, I mean, nobody really knows, obviously. I mean, like, except for some of the people who are working high up in the military, if that is happening or not. But in your opinion, do you think that maybe because Roswell happened and there's so many, I mean, there's always going to be conspiracy theories about something, obviously. But
Yeah,
there's a lot
yeah.
of stories with Roswell starting then. The government hid it because of they were working with them back then. That happened in New Mexico.
Yeah, I definitely think there is something to some of these conspiracies, especially with Roswell and how all of that went down. I don't know if you've ever read Nick Redfern's work on his opinions of Roswell, but it's really interesting and it's a lot more nefarious than aliens in the desert. It's more about uh, humanity being desecrated in the desert, and it's a very interesting read, and I would encourage people to check that out. It's a wildly different theory on on what Roswell is, and certainly fascinating. And we've also seen with this Navy, all these Navy videos coming out, that there was an admitted cover-up of UFOs within the government that came out in 2017, with this New York Times article that kind of blew the lid off of everything. But the government was sanctioning a certain amount of money for like this 5-7 year window to fund research and investigations into what these people in the military were seeing. And that, again, that didn't come out until 2017. So is it possible that they've been covering up UFOs since 1947 or even before that? Absolutely.
What's your opinion on Bob Lazar?
Bob Lazar is a nightmare and a train wreck, in my opinion.
I'm glad I asked you.
Yeah, he's fascinating to watch in interviews. He, boy, a lot of his story really does make sense, especially when you're going through the minutia of it, and you can actually get lost in that minutia, and you can start to convince yourself that a lot of this stuff makes sense. But once you kind of get yourself out of it and you start looking at it again, you're like, all right, there's some stuff that I don't really can track here, or I can follow from point A to point B. Fairly recently, I can't remember dates, but within the last 5-8 years, something like that, his computer business was raided by the FBI, and that was spun to be about Bob Lazar knowing something about UFOs, when in actuality there was some illegal activities happening within his business, and the FBI were investigating and took computers and hard drives from that business to investigate what was happening. I don't even know what the hell the outcome of that was, but the way it was spun into what actually happened, I think that really was the nail in the coffin for me about Bob Lazar. But it is a fascinating case. If I came upon Bob Lazar and that whole story, like George Knapp and all those guys did, I would definitely have run with it and written about it myself, because it's a fascinating story. But Bob Lazar, boy, it's, I'll go back to the beginning. He's a nightmare and a train wreck that I can't take my eyes off of. So
I want to quote you on that. I love that quote.
Sure. So if I don't care if there's 10 more documentaries that come out about him, I'm going to watch every one of them.
Well, that's exactly why I think what happened. He sort of believed what he was saying. Maybe I think in the very beginning came out and he started being on shows like Coast to Coast or these documentaries on Netflix or YouTube, and then people started saying, "Oh my God, tell me more!" And now the train wreck won't stop. I think he believes what he's saying, and I'm with you. I think that there's a lot more to it. Like you said, the perfect example is the FBI. Oh my God, they took my computer because of UFOs. No, they took it because you're doing illegal things. So it's interesting. But I want to talk about a credible case. Sure. And it was featured in your latest book called Granite Skies, which is a great book. I highly recommend it to all my viewers. Nomar Slevik, Grant Skies. Buy all his books; they're all great. But this one deals with Mike Stevens,
Yeah.
and his experiences with UFOs started pretty much the same age yours did, at age 3.5 to 4 years old.
Yeah, right around then. And for Mike, that would have been about 1983, 84, something like that. And this first encounter actually happened at his grandmother's house, and he was with his cousin at the time. And there was some sort of family function where there was a lot of family at the house at the time. And it was early evening, and Mike and his cousin, who again are like 2 and 3.5 years old, so very small children, and they somehow made their way out of the house in front of all of these adults. They were able to wander outside, and her house sat right on the road, so it's, a dangerous area for a toddler. And that always struck Mike really funny, like how did they get outside without adults seeing them and trying to figure out what they were doing trying to get outside. But anyways, they're outside, and while they're out there, they're standing in the driveway, and they see this UFO come up from behind the trees and float over to them, and they're watching it. It's about treetops length away from them, height. And while they're watching it, this sort of light goes on inside the UFO, which Mike describes as a classic dome-shaped silver disc. And this light goes on kind of like a dome light, and he and the cousin can see these silhouettes, shadows of some sort of beings in there. He said he could see two, maybe three of them. And they're watching it for a little while, and the next thing they know, they've moved over a few feet, and the UFO is now hovering over the telephone pole, which is right in the grandmother's driveway. And while I was interviewing him during this part of the conversation, I was like, what? Kind of like a bad edit in a sci-fi movie or something. He's like, yeah, exactly. Like, one moment we're here, then we were here, and the UFO is here, and it was there, and now it's here. And he's like, something happened in between there, but I don't know what it was. And then after a moment of it being over the telephone pole, it then shot straight up and disappeared. So it wasn't until years later, he was in his 20s, I think, where he had a hypnotic regression done on him about that particular encounter. And he remembered a bit more of what happened in that bad edit. And he said he recalls that he was on board this UFO, and he was horizontal. He doesn't know if he was floating or on some sort of table, but he recalls having aliens next to him. There was one at each shoulder and one by his head, and there were some down by his feet as well. And he recalled that there was some commotion about his cousin that was happening as well. And at that point in the hypnotic process, he kind of woke up out of it and couldn't remember anymore about what was going on with the cousin or anything. But the experience, or his perception of the experience, was that he was there for some sort of like doctor's checkup. Like, it was no big deal, and he seemed that to him it seemed medicinal, like this is just what they do, and this has happened before. And he's kind of thinking that maybe with the cousin and how it seemed a little bit more weird and more commotion going on over there, maybe it was like her first time or something. But again, that's all wild speculation, and that's all he remembers of that encounter. And he has not had any more hypnotic regression, since. So that's all
Why
he
is
knows
that?
about that. It's just not something that he's into doing right now. He's not opposed to it, and he may do it again if an opportunity presents itself. It's also an expensive process. You actually pay somebody to do it, and to invest some money into that. It's not something that he's interested in doing right now. A lot of people don't because of it. It's quite an expensive process.
Now, it seems apparent that most people who get picked up or abducted by aliens always have a loss of time and a loss of memory. Do you think there's anything to the fact where aliens will numb the brain so you don't remember anything, so they're not going around talking about it, that they really don't want you to remember what happened?
I don't think I could comment on the reasons those happen. I think the best thing I can comment on is that with all the people that I have interviewed and talked to about being abducted, that it's a common theme. People do have missing time. There are screen memories. There are reasons for these aliens not wanting them to remember or to know why they were taken. What those reasons are, again, I don't know, but it's certainly a common thread throughout these encounters.
Let's jump up to 1987. Mike had his second
Yeah,
encounter. That was very
yeah,
interesting.
yeah. It was a quite a long encounter. It actually spanned 9 months, and Mike was visited by these entities almost weekly. You know, every other week or almost weekly, and these entities presented themselves visually as like shadow people, what people in the haunting world might, describe as shadow people. But within that shadow, he described that there was movement, almost like black smoke or something was like inside of them. And he could perceive these four entities. He could perceive their sex and kind of what they represented. And two of the entities, to him, he perceived them as being military aliens of some sort, and that they weren't mean, but they were strict. And Mike had these lessons that he had to learn. Not like, hey, I'm gonna teach you your lesson, kid, but he had, like, academically, he had these lessons he had to learn, and these military type entities were in charge of making sure he was on track. There was this other entity that he perceived as female and much more motherly, and was the teacher of these, whatever these lessons were. And this other entity, which he did not see every time, was a child entity that he perceived as a boy. And he actually had a kind of fun or lighthearted encounter with that child entity on one night. He said he was sitting on the floor, and all of his communication with these entities was telepathic. And he's sitting on the floor and he's talking to this boy entity, and he asked it point blank, "What are you?" And just then, an image of Rosie the robot was projected into his mind, Rosie the robot from the Jetsons.
Yep.
And Mike and perceived that as being a joke, and they shared like an internal laugh about it. And it's one of the few times where there was like a lighthearted moment. With the female entity, one night, Mike said that she walked up to him. He was laying in bed, and she presented him with a box. Opened the box, and inside was this crystal quartz arrowhead. That's what it looked like to him. And she said, "This is the key." To this day, he has no idea what that means. It was not given to him. She just showed it to him. And then there was this last encounter. And during this last encounter, that was when Mike could actually see the entities in their true form, it seems like. He said that the two military type male aliens looked like typical gray aliens, although their skin color was more green brownish, and their skin was rough, kind of like a reptilian's. And they were in some sort of odd panicked state. He recalls them being very calm, very regimented, and this panic state seemed very out of the ordinary to him. He said the female entity was a little bit shorter, maybe 4 feet, and her skin was a bit smoother than the male entities. And he perceived that during this encounter, where he could see them in their true form, that they had intervened in a potential different abduction that another species was attempting on Mike, and that they stepped in and stopped it for whatever reason. And he perceived that they probably weren't supposed to intervene. And maybe that's why they were in their panicked state. And also, that could have been why that ended up being the last encounter and why they were in their true form.
Interesting. It's similar to the United Nations. No, that's our country. We're going to take over that country. You leave that one alone. That belongs to us. So
Yeah.
even up there in space, they have their own issues too. So
Yeah.
in your opinion, not all aliens are friendly towards each other. I'm sure, like I said, this is all opinion. We don't really know for sure, but you think that there's many species. You and I were talking off air about this. Two that are most popular are the grays, obviously, and then the Swedes, which look more like human with blonde hair. Then you have the reptilians. That's three. So there's many different species that people see, but grays seem the most common.
Yeah, grays definitely seem to be the most common, but I'm not very interested or up to speed on species. I mean,
Yeah.
it's wildly subjective. There are people, abductees and researchers that talk about species as fact and have diagrams of all of them in these books and documentaries, and that just seems wild to me. And I don't hold a lot of stock into that. Just in my experiences alone, he's described some entities that are like nothing in any of these books. So I don't really know what to make of the species part of it. But as far as like the United Nations part of it, and their and maybe more nefarious beings as opposed to kinder beings, I think it's probably a lot like humans. There's good people, bad people, racist people, kind people, and that probably transcends the universe. Again, that's wild speculation and theory, but I think that's a possibility. Absolutely.
Well, that's Bob Lazar.
Yeah.
Well, I want to move on to Mike Stevens, the Farmington, New Hampshire years.
Yeah, he had a lot of different encounters. He lived in two different places in Farmington and had encounters at both of them. But a couple of them that stand out to me are one night, at this point, Mike was around 12 years old or so, and he had this odd hobby of melting crayons on a light bulb on a lamp in his room that was by this window. So he's doing that one night for whatever reason. He still doesn't know why. He's melting crayons, and all of a sudden, there's this alien. The face of an alien is in his window. And it's not just this small face in the window. It's taken up the entire window. And to him, it seems like some sort of hologram or projection or, something like that. And while he's like staring into the eyes of this alien face that's in front of him, this blue jay comes crashing into the window and disrupts the alien face. It goes away and it scares the hell out of Mike. To the point where like he's still scared of birds because of this encounter. And Mike he's a big brutish fellow, and he thinks it's kind of funny that he's scared of birds, but not these other sort of more, scarier things. Kind of funny there. But in that same house, this was a few weeks later, I believe, Mike doesn't know why, but he woke up in the middle of the night and got up and walked to that same window and looked out of it. And while he's looking out of it, he sees these four entities in his backyard. And he described them as like troll-like beings. They were very small. They were like 3 feet tall. And they were wearing like really rustic clothes. Like he described them as like burlap sacks and a similar color. And they were all holding spade shovels. And in front of them were dug perfectly round circles in the ground. He has no idea why he's seeing that. And even in that moment, in his opinion, he said it didn't seem like the true vision of what was actually happening. In that moment, he was like, I'm having a screen memory. Like, this isn't what actually happened tonight. And he's carried that with him, into adulthood. And even to this day, he'll describe it as a very weird encounter, but probably not what he was actually seeing, that it was some sort of screen memory involved with the aliens trying to show him something different than was actually happening. Very odd.
When he went outside the next day, there were no holes in the ground?
No holes, no evidence that anything was there.
Well, Mike had an experience that has been shared by many experiencers. They've spoken about humanity's involvement in the Earth's demise, natural disasters, and ultimate destruction of Earth. Do you think that the aliens are trying to warn us?
Oh boy, that kind of goes back to the species thing,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of aspects or sub theories within ufology. that people kind of latch on to, or are more interested in, and some are more interested in species, some are more interested in nuts and bolts UFOs, some are more into the otherworldly nature of UFOs and their plasma balls, and they travel through wormholes and blah blah blah. So when it comes to, are the aliens trying to warn us about something, I don't know. I don't have a theory about it. It's not something I subscribe to. It's certainly interesting. Like, I'll always read a story about it. There's a great story that John Mack wrote about um, an experiencer who had been abducted by aliens, and he was brought aboard this UFO and was in like this class scenario with other alien beings, which was really interesting. And there was like a professor at the front of this UFO class, and a lot of the teachings that this experiencer talked about were about natural disasters, and that humanity really needs to learn from their errors and learn to protect the environment. So it's certainly a running theme, but not something I've researched thoroughly.
That's what I was leading to with John Mack. I wanted to get your opinion on his theory. You answered that. So
Cool. I really enjoy John Mack. I enjoy
yeah.
John Mack's work.
Well, there came a point when Mike became paranoid and delusional. So I want you to tell me about the troll creature with the toolbox that began his change in behavior to a point of acceptance.
Yeah, sure. This was a really strange one, and a good point to transition into not just the encounters, but Mike the person, and what he was going through and what his mental health was like during this time. So his mental health had been deteriorating for quite a while during these encounters, and especially when he got into his 20s. His marriage was falling apart. He was having trouble being an adult, and he would be the first to admit that as well. I'm not saying anything that's not in the book. He shared all of this, but what's really interesting is that Mike suffers from anxiety and depression and some PTSD, and I have my own struggles with diagnosed anxiety and depression, and things that some trauma that I'm still processing, and trying to let go of some things and learn from some things and be a better person from some things, and to not get to the point of potentially like self-harm. That's how a lot of this. Can you hear me?
It's fading in and out. I mean, for the most part, I can hear you perfectly. Can you hear me?
All right. Yeah, I can hear you, but I just got this notification here.
No, see, now you're right there. You're better. I mean, I could hear what you're saying, but every once
Okay.
in a while, it'll get a little grainy, is a good way to put it.
Okay. But I'm sounding okay right now?
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
So anyways, so mental health, Mike's mental health at this point was playing a big part in him trying to cope with all of these encounters. And his marriage was falling apart at this point, and he was really just struggling to be an adult and be a father to his child, who was very young at the time. So he had this encounter one night, but there was this troll-like being that was next to his bed. And from Mike's perception, he saw that this entity had a toolbox with him. And he was tinkering with Mike's head. And Mike asked him, like, what are you doing? And it's really funny how Mike described the alien. He almost described him like a grumpy plumber or something. Like, shut up, kid. I'm just trying to get this done. You know what I mean? And in Mike's opinion, whatever tinkering was going on in his head was supposed to sort of help him cope with everything that was happening to him. Like, whatever species this tinkering alien was from was sanctioned to go there to help Mike get through these experiences, almost as if they knew he was struggling and needed some help. He doesn't know what sort of tinkering took place. That's just what this grumpy plumber-like alien told him. But the following days, weeks, and years, he was better able to cope with everything. And actually, it kind of flipped a switch for him, where he was better able to handle these encounters and to not maybe be so frightened of them, but now he wanted to learn and maybe try to figure out what this phenomenon was. And that's when his studies of ufology really started to take shape. Because before, he was just a scared experiencer who was suffering from anxiety, depression, and PTSD, and was failing at life. Now he was going to own what was happening to him, learn about it, and eventually get to a place where he could help other people going through similar things. So that was a turning point with this odd, grumpy plumber alien, you know?
Like Schneider with an attitude from one day
Yeah.
at a time.
Yeah.
Did the aliens ever tell him why they were always visiting him?
No,
Never. So they never had a reason. Like he
no.
wasn't one, like in Close Encounters. Like giving, I know that was a movie, but Richard Dreyfuss was sort of chosen by the aliens, and they were giving him all these signs. It wasn't like that where they had a connection with him for some reason.
Yeah, not that he knows of. And these experiences, even though there's a book that I wrote and the book has an ending, these experiences are ongoing. You know, like he still messages me or calls me to this day, telling me new stuff that's happened to him. You know, so it's ongoing, and whatever's going on has yet to reveal itself. You know.
We talked about the troll with the toolbox, but it wasn't until he was scrolling through Facebook and that really changed his life. What happened?
Ugh. This is a tough one, and really important that Mike shared it. Uh, Mike got to the point where he was so low mental health wise that he had devised a plan to end his life. He didn't want to deal with the encounters anymore. He didn't want to deal with what his life had become anymore. And this is coming off a center in New Hampshire that Mike was a part of closed its doors. Mike runs what's called the Granite Sky Services. And Granite Sky Services helps families and individuals cope with alien encounters. Whether it's a west sky or full-blown abduction, Mike has group meetings or individual meetings to help people cope with this. And a lot of those meetings, or all of those meetings, took place at the KRI Center for Consciousness Studies in Stratham, New Hampshire. And the owner of that decided to close its doors. That's also where Mike was living. So with those doors closing, not being able to have those meetings, which helped Mike just as much as he helped other people, it also meant he had no place to live and became homeless. So, fast forward a few weeks, and he had devised a plan to end his life because he was sick of it all. And the plan is outlined in sad detail in the book. Like he bought his favorite beer, he was going to hang himself. There's a whole process. And while during this planning, he decided to, for no other reason other than out of habit, he grabbed his phone and started flipping through Facebook. And while flipping through Facebook, he found out that a close friend of his had passed away. And it rocked his world. He couldn't believe that it happened. He actually thought it was a joke, and he was going to refresh or keep scrolling and find out that it was some sort of weird, sick joke, but it wasn't. This guy that Mike knew had passed away, and it was from, it wasn't from self-harm or anything like that. But this really rocked Mike's world, and he let that sit with him for quite a while. And as it sat with him and how much it affected him, and going to the funeral, and how much the death of this beloved person in his life affected many other people, he knew that if he went through with his plan to end his life, that he would cause a similar amount of grief to other people. And he did not want to do that. So he credits this beloved person in his life's death for saving his own life. Because he just knew that he couldn't put people through that. Despite whatever he was going through and what he had to deal with internally, he didn't want to hurt other people. So after the funeral and moving forward, and even to this day, he's choosing to live. And it's really hard sometimes. And he's still dealing with all the other stuff that he's been dealing with, but he's choosing life as opposed to, I don't want to deal with it. He does want to deal with it. He's still homeless, and he's made, set some goals for himself to not be that way anymore. And he set some other goals for himself, mental health wise, that he's working towards. And the most important part to all of this, because I'm kind of dragging on now, is that he's choosing life. And I think that's amazing. I struggled with that myself. I'm still here. I'm talking to you. So I've chosen life thus far, but normalizing the discussion of suicide or suicidal ideation is a big deal to me and Mike, because people do have these thoughts. You're not crazy for having suicidal thoughts. It happens all the time, and it's okay and it's normal. And it doesn't mean that you're actually going to kill yourself. It means that you need some sort of change, or it actually might mean that you're going to kill yourself. But I have those own thoughts myself, and again, I'm still here, so it's going okay. But there are really, really bad days, and there are some okay days, and Mike has those too, and he's choosing life, so I think that's pretty cool.
I'm glad both you and Mike chose life.
Cool.
You both have a lot of important work to do. There's a lot of work that you're going to be helping people with their acceptance and what they're going through, and realizing that they're not alone as well. So we need the both of you.
Thanks, man.
All right. Well, I want to talk about Mike, how he helped with the marker for Betty and Barney Hill. Speaking of putting two UFO abductees together, and why it was so important to him.
Sure. Mike suffered an injury quite a while ago, and he was going to be laid up for a while. And while he was literally, like, he couldn't walk, sitting on a couch and just trying to get better, he was watching a lot of UFO shows and reading a lot of UFO books. And the Betty and Barney Hill incident, since it happened in New Hampshire and Mike's a New Hampshire native, that story really stuck with him. And he thought it would be a great idea to somehow get some sort of state-sanctioned marker up on the highway where this encounter happened to Benny and Barney Hill. So he had no idea what the process was. So he just started kind of Googling things and trying to figure some things out. And it turns out that there needs to be, some forms filled out and some signatures to be gotten. But it was still a pretty big monumental process that he wasn't quite sure how to resolve on his own. So he started reaching out to some prominent figures in ufology. He reached out to Bill Burns. He reached out to quite a few folks. And he finally reached out to Kathleen Martin, which is the niece of Betty Hill. And Kathleen Martin has worked extensively and very closely with Stanton Friedman. She worked with MUFON. She might still be with MUFON. I'm not even sure. I actually don't associate with MUFON anymore because they're a nightmare as well in a train wreck. But anyway, he reached out to Kathleen Martin, and that's where this really took hold. Mike was the catalyst and started a little bit of the legwork, and then Kathleen Martin snatched onto it and took the rest of the way and finally got that marker put up. And Mike was credited as being the catalyst for that, which is really great of Kathleen Martin, because she could have totally, wrangled that to her own favor, but she didn't. She gave Mike credit, which is really great.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. You have some other stories in the book. Like I said, it's a great book. I went through it in one sitting. I loved it. I want to talk about Eric and Shelley Martin.
Oh, yeah. That's a fascinating story. I first actually heard of their story from a Sci-Fi Channel episode of Paranormal Witness. I am a sucker for the guilty pleasure of paranormal television. There's a lot of it I don't agree with. There's methods I don't agree with, but I can't keep my eyes off of them. I love watching them. Skinwalker Ranch is a great series, just so you know. But Paranormal Witness is kind of like today's version of Unsolved Mysteries, if you will, but they're all the paranormal stories, which is awesome.
Yeah.
But they typically deal with hauntings. That's a lot of the retellings. There's recreations, dramatizations of what happened, and interviews with the actual people. So on this particular episode of Paranormal Witness, these two people from my home state of Maine, which really gets my feelers going, like, oh, this happened in Maine. That's amazing. So Eric and Shelley Martin, they experienced dogmen on their property. And it's just almost a harrowing tale of what happened. Now, where this story originated from, or where it was first publicly published, was actually in a book by Linda Godfrey. Shelley had reached out to Linda about dogmen because Linda Godfrey is the godmother, I guess, is a better term for everything dogmen related. And so she first published this story about Eric and Shelley Martin. And what happened is one night, Eric and Shelley are kind of chilling in on their porch, and they had a habit of drinking coffee at night. And so they're out there drinking coffee, and they start seeing these odd figures right beyond the fence of part of their property. And they're seeing, the eyes of these creatures. And, some are tall, some are short. And they're looking and trying to figure out what it was, when one of them stands up, and they can see the silhouette of this werewolf looking creature. And they described it as around 7-8 feet tall, so very, very tall. And it freaked them both out. So Shelley ran inside, and Eric wanted to get a gun, but his gun was in the shed, which was actually where these creatures were. And I think all told at that point, there were 5 of these creatures on their property that they could see at that point. So anyways, fast forward a little bit, and everybody's inside the house, barricaded themselves in the house. And these creatures are now on the porch and on the roof, Kentucky Goblin style. You know what I mean? If you remember that story from 52 or whatever. And they're just skulking around the property, and almost seems like they're trying to get in, but maybe they don't understand doors and windows. So they're just kind of banging on things. And so Eric and Shelley are hiding up in their daughter's bedroom. The daughter is there as well. And the daughter doesn't really know what's going on and doesn't really see these creatures, so she thinks her parents are being a little bit weird, but she can hear what's happening. So she knows something's going on. At one point, Shelley looks out her daughter's window, and she can see a few of the dogmen. And she sees that one of the dogmen, a smaller dogman, is on the back of a larger dogman. And she actually thought that they might have been having sex at first. And then she realized as she was watching them that it might have been a juvenile and a mother. And the mother was carrying the juvenile on the back. Well, anyways, you fast forward again, finally around 4, 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, they have finally left the property. Everything's been quiet now for a couple of hours. The sun is finally coming up, and they go outside, and they're seeing tons of claw marks and evidence of these creatures being on their property. Wild story.
I want to move on from the dogmen to the Dover Demon.
Oh, Dover Demon. That's one of my favorite cases that actually has fallen into the category of cryptozoology. Lauren Coleman, again, who is a resident of my home state of Maine, he's down in the Portland, Maine area, and he actually runs and curates the International Cryptozoology Museum. And back in the late 70s, he was living and working down in the Massachusetts area. And, 3 teenage boys one night, I forget the date range, maybe it was April, I'm not 100% sure, but they were driving down the road in Dover, Massachusetts. And while they were driving, the driver of the car, Bill Bartlett, I believe is his name, he witnessed this odd-looking creature on this dilapidated stone wall on the side of the road while he was driving. He he saw this really odd creature. Now, to describe this creature is really to describe a gray alien. It's got a distended abdomen. It's got a big, round head. It's got crazy eyes, spindly limbs. But the thing about how he saw the creature, it was on all fours, if you will, crawling on this dilapidated stone wall. He asked his buddies if, like, hey, did you see that? And they're like, no, like, what did you see? And so he tried to describe it, and they're like, oh, you got to turn around so we can go see it. So they turn around, they don't see it. So that's his encounter. He goes home and he draws a picture of what he saw. I can't remember if it was the same night or the next night, but in another area of town, there's a teenager and he's walking. And in front of him, 50 yards, maybe 100 yards in front of him, he sees something walking towards him. And as it's getting closer to him, it actually looks like one of his buddies. And so he calls out to it. It's like, hey, whatever name he used, like, what are you doing out right now? And the thing just kind of stopped walking. And he's like, and so he's getting closer to it. And he's like, that's not my friend. I don't know what that is. And it took off, running off the road and into a field. And it ran into this field a little bit and stopped next to a tree and kind of like held on to the tree, like to lean against it, if you will, was holding on with one of its arms, I guess. And he got just a really good look at it in the moonlight. He was much closer to it at this point. And that was basically his encounter. It took off. He took off and he went home and he drew a picture of what he saw. Now, again, I don't know if it was the same night or another night, there was a girl and her boyfriend were driving around Dover, New Hampshire. And the girl was in the passenger seat, and she was a teenager too, a young girl. And she saw, again, the same type of creature on the side of the road and was like, whoa, did you see that? Like, what is that? Her boyfriend never saw it, or saw it so briefly, like he maybe kind of remembers the eyes. I'm not 100% sure on that. So anyway, she go home and she draws what she thinks it looks like, because it was very odd to her. And then the story started getting out around town that 3 different teenagers who didn't really know each other, I think the 2 boys were aware of each other, but they weren't friends. But 3 different teenagers in the same town on the same night or within a 3-day period all saw this really strange alien-looking creature. And it started getting around town, and the police were involved a little bit. And Lauren Coleman, who even at that time in the 70s was a researcher of cryptids, he happened into a gas station in the Dover area, and the cashier was actually talking about it, and he overheard it. And he's like, what's going on? And so she explained what she knew of the story and got a couple of witness names, and he just took that and went running with it. So he actually coined the term Dover Demon, which has gone down in legend, which is amazing that he coined that term. And he also got a few other investigators involved. And the investigators he got involved, one was Walter Webb. I forget the name of the other one, but they were actually UFO investigators. But he knew they did really good work. So he kind of summoned them to come down, and so they could all do separate interviews with the witnesses. And then that's when they found out about the drawings. They compared the drawings, and they are of the same creature, entity, whatever the hell it is. And that was, really, I guess, telling or led credibility to that they actually saw something. And people in the town actually spoke really highly of all 3 teenagers, which is another great thing. Even, principals and teachers and parts of the police department all held these kids in high regard, which is, really great, when they're a witness to something otherworldly like that. So despite the thorough investigation, nobody knows what the hell the Dover Demon is. It's never been seen again, which is crazy, And that's basically where the story ends. There's a little side note where Lauren Coleman might have had a little bit of an encounter with Men in Black, sort of, or indirectly, if you will. But that's for, another time. But I've loved that story. I've known about that story since the late 80s, I think. And I knew that Lauren Coleman was the investigator of it. And so I made sure to get books of his. And, there were some mentions of it, but there was never like the full story of what happened in it. anyways, to me, after seeing those drawings, it always looked like an alien to me, a gray alien. But because Lauren was the chief investigator of this story, or I don't know if that's why, but it has landed in the realm of cryptozoology as opposed to ufology. It's known as a cryptid story as opposed to a alien story. But I could never shake the feeling of this cryptid looked like an alien to me. So I wanted to know if there was any sort of UFO sightings in that area during that time frame. So I scoured MUFON, I scoured New Fork to see if I could find anything, and I couldn't. And I was even looking like a couple months before, a couple months after, I couldn't find anything. Then my first book on UFOs, UFOs Over Maine, was published by Schiffer Publishing. And they're really great, very small, independent publisher. And they actually sent me some books they had in their catalog that they thought that I might kind of get a kick out of, And so they sent me a few UFO books, a few cryptozoology books. And there's this one book by a guy named Christopher, I can't remember his last name, but it's called Curious Creatures. And it's a really cool cover with like a Bigfoot footprint on the front. And in this story, he tells the story of the Dover Demon. And somehow he found another witness that Lauren Coleman, none of these guys ever talked to before, who had witnessed the Dover Demon that night. So we're talking about a fourth witness to the Dover Demon. And this was a big deal in my world, like, what? There's a fourth witness? And that same fourth witness, the next night, his family, again, during the Dover Demon viewing time frame, his entire family witnessed a UFO in the Dover area. So I'm like, yes, finally a connection, a UFO connection to the Dover Demon case. So I tried to track down this author. I was trying to use the social medias. There's even contact information in the book itself to try to get a hold of the author. So I sent a couple of emails, never heard back from the author, which sucked. But all I could basically do was quote his writings of the UFO connection, in the Granite Skies book, just to have that UFO connection. But I thought it was fascinating that after all these years, and this book that Schiffer sent me, years ago, had this story of the Dover Demon and this UFO connection in it. Very fascinating to me.
Interesting things out there, like the Dogman, Dover Demon. In
Yeah.
your experience with investigating different stories, has there ever been a connection between Bigfoot and UFOs?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And not in any like serious research that I have done for like a published work, but I'm fascinated by Bigfoot and the otherworldly connection and the flesh and blood Bigfoot as well. That's been an interest of mine for since childhood. But for me, the otherworldly connection to Bigfoot is utterly fascinating. And Stan Gordon out of Pennsylvania has done a ton of work in this area. In his area of Pennsylvania that he typically researches and investigates and talks to witnesses is in the Chestnut Ridge area, which has had numerous Sasquatch sightings and UFO sightings and alien and Men in Black encounters. And there have been Men in Black and Bigfoot encounters where there was this incident at a trailer park where a Bigfoot was reported to have like smashed against a trailer. And this woman opened the door and like saw this Bigfoot, and it took off running, and there was still a footprint there. And so her son went out and took a Polaroid picture of it to make sure he documented it. And that same night, it's reported that Men in Black came and talked to this woman and to this child and asked for the Polaroid picture and crumpled it up in front of them and scuffed out the Bigfoot print, on the ground, and told them to never talk about this. And there's been other stories of, there's one story that a witness reported a Bigfoot hanging from a rope that was attached to a UFO as it flew above the treetops, But I guess on a more serious note, there have been other reports of a UFO sighting, at one particular hour or one particular day. And then a few hours later or a couple days later, there have been reports of Bigfoot in that same vicinity. And that causes a connection in and of itself, because two such strange things, they must be related in some way. Some people theorize that Bigfoot are aliens, and that's why they're so elusive, and people can't find evidence of them if they were flesh and blood like a bear or something like that. So yeah, there's a lot of theories, and I think it's all fascinating as hell.
You know what? That makes much more sense to me, because you brought up exactly what I was going to say. I spoke with somebody who has I'm going to use the word Bigfoot Foundation. They do Bigfoot investigations. And I asked them, I said, if Bigfoot exists, why were there never any Bigfoot bodies? And his answer was, well, they bury their dead. But what you're saying is, to me, is much more easily explained, because if they're aliens, they're not from this earth. So I believe that more than I would believe that they're living in the mountains, because I think if they live in the mountains, we're going to find a dead carcass somewhere at one time. So instead
Yeah,
of just
that's
easily explaining
interesting.
it that we bury them, or they bury them.
Yeah, that's interesting. I actually tend to lean towards more that they're flesh and blood, which is kind of interesting. Um, and it's because of the similar cases when it comes to bear and moose, and specifically gorillas, and how they were not a known species just for years and years and years, and they lived in the jungles and in the mountains right under people's noses, and these are giant creatures. And people don't typically find bear carcasses or moose carcasses, and if they are dying a natural death in the woods in a secluded area, then they're biodegrading, if you will, and that definitely does take time. So you think there would be more bones found. I'm not necessarily a believer that they bury their dead, but I'm definitely thinking that it's just such secluded areas that people aren't finding them in time. But it's also all theory and wild speculation, and I'm not even sure if they're real.
Yeah.
So
But we're going with the speculation that they are real. We're trying to figure out what they are, aliens or from this earth. So,
yeah, I do have a preference. I hope they're connected to aliens.
well, our mutual friend Bill Brock has an interesting theory about Bigfoot. He thinks that
Please tell me.
they are what were the first humans? Before humans, there
Oh,
was um,
like Neanderthals?
Neanderthals. That's his
Okay,
explanation is that there's Neanderthals that never died.
interesting.
Yeah,
I
I remember
I
I
can
saw
get
him
down with
speak.
that.
Yeah, me too. When I listened to him, I was like, you know what, that makes sense as well. I mean, there's a lot of things that they theorize, and like, yeah, that could be it. Yeah, we never know.
Yeah,
But you mentioned several times the Men in Black, though. What's the
yeah.
connection between Men in Black and aliens?
Well, the Men in Black seems as old as the UFO, modern UFO topic itself. They started rearing their ugly or mysterious heads, if you will, back in the late 40s, early 50s. But witnesses or people that have encountered the Men in Black, uh, that they are some sort of government well, I guess there's two camps, that they are some sort of government sanctioned secret organization of UFO witness hushers, if you will. They go to an area, they intimidate and scare witnesses to the point of not talking about their UFO encounter, and almost reversing their standpoint, like, you know what, this actually didn't happen, and taking back claims. So they are in the hush UFO business. There's another camp of people who believe in Men in Black, that they are in fact aliens themselves, and they are more nefarious, where they may kidnap witnesses or experiencers of the phenomenon. But it's still some sort of hush talk about UFOs. They're still trying to scare and intimidate witnesses, but some people believe that they are aliens and not humans acting for aliens.
Do you have a preference for that? Like what you believe?
Uh, I guess I've always, just in the back of my mind, because I don't think about it too often, I'll always read a Men in Black story, don't get me wrong. And I've
Yeah.
actually written about Men in Black one time in this case, in a case that took place in Maine. But I guess in the back of my mind, I've always thought that they were part of, that they were human and part of some sort of secret government agency.
Right. What is the significance between animals and extraterrestrial contact?
Well, there's some researchers in ufology that have made a connection to, this missing time and screen memories that we've talked about briefly during our discussion. That some of these screen memories are replaced with visions of animals. Most notably, there's a researcher, Mike Cleland, who has associated these screen memories with owls and other types of birds. But people have had many different types of animals. Mike himself has had different types of screen memory encounters with deer, albino deer, which are very rare. But also other large type birds like hawks, things like that. So I guess the connection is it's part of the screen memory process. And if you wake up recalling seeing, an owl, or having, like, you have an odd misplacement of memory, but you knew something took place, but all you can think of or envision or remember is an owl or some sort of animal before whatever happened, then that is supposed to be a sign of some sort of alien intervention occurred. I suppose that's the best way to put it, but I'm no expert on it. So
Was there a correlation between alien abduction and psychic ability?
there have been some psychic ability and alien interactions, but it kind of goes back to, the animals, and actually goes back to like the Bigfoot stuff. It's just all theory. Some people believe that after an encounter, that they feel more psychically in tuned to others or to themselves, or they can start predicting events in the future that are going to happen. Some people have a heightened paranormal activity happen in their home after an alien encounter, so something you might associate, bumps in the night, or things that you associate with ghosts or haunting. Some UFO experiencers have that happen after their encounters, a few weeks or a few months after their encounters. Sometimes it's ongoing, but yeah, there's been lots of different connections. And I think that's why it's really important to not get bogged down into ufology, cryptozoology, hauntings, things like that. Like, if you just look at everything for what it is, weird stuff's happening, talk to anybody and ask questions, I think that will help you kind of gather a lot more information where you can start making some of these connections, because maybe it's all freaking connected.
That's why I love talking to you, because you are very knowledgeable in all aspects of the paranormal, and you have opinions. But again, like I said, what makes you so credible to me is that you don't just accept everything as fact. You look
Yeah.
into it and say, well, you know what, it might be this. All right, well, I believe this 10%. I'm going to go with you. So that's why I love talking to you. And there's something else. So I love going. I have a whole list of different things that you talked about in your book, and we went from the Dogmen to Dover Demon to Men in Black. Now I want to talk about the hybrid children, and what's your opinion on that theory?
Hybrid children. First of all, hybrid children, like, I guess for a definition's sake, is an alien child that is had by a human. So the term hybrid is it's part human, part alien. That you mostly find women reporting this. Human women are giving birth to hybrid alien children. But some men have come forward too that their semen was taken and used for hybrid abilities. And I don't know if that was with a female alien, or if an alien egg was united with human sperm and put into a female. Not sure, a human female. I'm not sure how any of that works, but just for definition's sake, that's what a hybrid alien or a hybrid child is. And that's a tough one for me. um, that every time I read about it, honestly, I don't even like reading about it, to be honest. It's just really hard for me to believe that that is something that's going on. Um, but at the same time, I'm a researcher and I'm non-judgmental. I'm kind, and I always have an open ear for anyone. So if a witness comes to me and a hybrid child is part of their story, I'm not going to laugh at them. I'm not going to tell them, all right, stop the conversation. This is over now. I don't believe you. Just personally speaking, that's tough for me to wrap my head around. But I will take one of those stories and then I will, and if it's okay with them, I will present it in my work. But I will present it in my work in such a way as this is up for you to decide whether you believe or not. Because it's not up for me to make that decision for you. So here's this story. Here's what it could be. Here's what it might be. You decide. So Mike has one of these stories. And that really surprised me. And the way Mike was informed of this information really lends to its credibility, I guess, because I've just never heard of anything like this before. So Mike was with his girlfriend at the time. He was over at her house having dinner. As Mike puts it, he eats lightning fast. He just shovels food into his mouth and then he's done. So he finished eating before her and wanted to go outside to have a cigarette before she started to clean up. So he's outside, he's having a cigarette, and he said all of a sudden, like he wasn't thinking about UFOs, he saw nothing in the sky. He said all of a sudden this message came to him, and then he just knew that he had a child out in the cosmos. And for some reason, it made him very emotional. It impacted him really hard. So he comes inside. He's in tears at this point. And his girlfriend's like, well, what's going on? What happened? He tells her what happened. And, she didn't say one way or another whether she believed him or not. She wasn't giving him a hard time. She knew that obviously something happened. And to this day, he has not had any sort of follow-up information happen. It was just that kind of one message that happened. And that was very blatant, blunt, like, you have a child, like, deal with it. You know what I mean? Because before that, a couple of years before that, there may have been a few signs here and there that he didn't quite pick up on. Like he was at the KRI center that I mentioned earlier, and he was outside having a cigarette, and he saw this light in the sky, but it was way up there, star-sized, and it was kind of doing figure eights and circling around, and he's like, they can never leave me alone, because satellites don't do that. He knows planes don't do that. So that was just another minor UFO sighting that he had. When he was done having that cigarette, he's inside the KRI center, and he started to hear the laughter of a little girl. Well, in his mind, that actually scared him, and he was thinking it was the ghost of a little girl. But after he got this message, he was starting to kind of like put two and two together, and like, oh, were they trying to tell me somehow? Like, oh, light in the sky, here's a girl laughing, like, you have a kid out here. And that was too broad or too general for him to get. So they had to send him a direct message,
I'll tell you what my biggest concern would be with that. It's like, I don't owe child support, do I? I'd be bringing this alien child to Maury Povich. You are not the father.
That's a good way to look at it, man.
Well, it's been great talking to you. You have so many interesting stories. I have one more story I want to talk to you about. It happened at Loring Air Force Base. I love this story.
Yeah. So Loring Air Force Base is in northern Maine. It's not as far north as Fort Kent, but it's pretty close. And you don't want to go much farther than Loring anyways. There's not much up there. Loring Air Force Base was operational until 1994. And during 1977, I think October 1977, when the base was active, and it was a nuclear base as well. They housed nuclear weapons there. Some of their bombers were outfitted with nuclear weapons. During a 3-night period, the base was ransacked by a UFO. and there were numerous witnesses to this event. So on the first night, people were seeing a UFO hovering over their airspace, which is a big no-no. You don't go flying over Air Force bases, especially ones armed with nukes, nuclear technology. And so, the sirens were sounded, and there were actually distress signals sent out to nearby Air Force bases, like that there was an intruder at Loring Air Force Base. So this went out for most of the East Coast Air Force bases. So it was no secret that there was something in the skies. And it was captured on radar. And even the wing commander, which was the highest ranking officer at that base during that time, saw it with his own two eyes, saw a UFO hovering over the base. It culminated to the point where the UFO was seen hovering over the runway at Loring Air Force Base, like it was 3 feet over the runway. And Maine State Police and military police converged on the craft. And witnesses described it as not like how Mike described, the silver dome disc. They described it as like a plasma object. Like it was just like pulsating and was awash with light. Like light was just all different types of light were just kind of intertwining with itself. And it was there in front of them, less than 10 yards in front of them, less than 3 feet above the runway. Police and military police are looking at this thing, and then it just blinked out. It disappeared right in front of their eyes. It was then seen on radar over Nova Scotia like seconds later. So very, very odd encounter. And that area of Maine and the Air Force has actually had numerous UFO encounters. That's just the most famous one that's been in like the Time Life books, and that's been discussed on some paranormal television shows and things like that. That's the one that's been written about the most. So I had the dumb idea that I wanted to go to Loring Air Force Base and just check out the area for myself. So again, the base closed in 1994, but there are businesses that are open around it, around the peripheral of the base, but the base itself is abandoned. And it is filled with dilapidated and rusting structures, hangars, old apartments for Air Force people. Like it looks like it's right out of The Walking Dead. It is friggin' wild. And you can go there and explore. It's cool, and you don't pay. I was going to be on the base in the middle of the night, like I'm talking between like midnight and like 4 a.m, and I wasn't sure how kosher that was. So I actually stopped into the Limestone Police Department, let them know like, hey, I'm a UFO researcher. This is what I'm going to be doing if people report, somebody driving on the base that late. And they're like, okay, weirdo, go have fun. And so I'm on the base, and I went there during the day and I explored everywhere. I must have taken 1,000 pictures. There are these massive hangars. I did EVP sessions inside of hangars, and I drove my car 100 miles an hour down one of the runways. Like it was amazing, right? And then I went back at night. So now it's about, I can't remember if it was 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, something like that. And I'm sitting in the middle of the runway in the complete, because there's no power, so it's complete darkness, okay? And I'm sitting in the runway approximately where this UFO was encountered by the police and military police. And I wanted to see, all these years later, if I could see something. Well, it had been kind of an overcast day, and it's been drizzling, and I'm sitting there in the complete dark, like I don't have the radio on or anything, and I'm starting to get this headache. And I'm thinking it's because I hadn't had a cigarette in a while. I have since quit smoking paper cigarettes. Anyway, but I hadn't had a cigarette in a while, and the drizzle like kind of turned into white noise after a while. So I just had this headache. So I got out of the car. That was the first moment of light that I saw, which was the dome light coming on. So it kind of disoriented me a bit. I get out of the car, close the door, I light a cigarette, and then I can start to hear something or someone walking up the runway. I'm like, what is that? I'm like, that's footsteps. So I get in front of my car, and I'm like squinting my ears, if you will, like what am I hearing? And I'm looking down the runway, and it's just complete darkness. Although um, my car is turned on at this point, so my dome light is still on and the dash lights are on and stuff. I'm like, what is that? And then I realized that because my car's on, it was my windshield wipers, and it was doing an intermittent. So I scared the crap out of myself, right?
That's funny.
Because the last thing I want to do, like, I love researching this stuff, but running into an alien would be pretty terrifying, I'm pretty sure. So anyways, I'm scared at this point. So I get back in the car and I'm like, I'm going to go to another area and observe over there for a while. So I go to where the radar tower was, or still is, it's still standing. And I'm actually parked in its parking lot. And I got the radar tower right just slightly to my left, and I got huge open sky. Okay. And I'm just kind of looking at the radar tower because just in the moonlight, you can see it. I still have everything turned off in the car. It's not running. And I'm looking at the radar tower, and right off to the right and much higher, a light in the sky appeared. And there's cloud cover, so it's under the cloud cover. And I'm just human in that moment. I'm not Nomar, the UFO researcher, whatever the hell people call me. I'm just human in that moment. And I have gear next to me. I have a parabolic mic. I got night vision cameras and all that stuff. I'm just looking at it like an idiot with my jaw dropped, and I'm holding my cell phone. And I'm like, oh God, I got to get this on video. So I turn on the camera on my cell phone, and I start filming it. And I say a little something. I don't even know what I said. And I start the car, and I want to try to drive so I can be like underneath it, Yeah. And so as soon as I start to move, the light does this weird shimmering thing and blinks out. And I caught all of it on camera, and you can actually watch it on my YouTube channel. You can just YouTube search, Loring UFO, something like that. And I'm sure my video is in there somewhere.
Where I found it was Nomar Slevik on YouTube. That's where I found it.
Okay, there you go. But from a skeptic standpoint, and really from my own standpoint, looking back at that encounter, it's just a light in the sky. It really could have been anything. But given the history of that area, I chalked it up to something more otherworldly than maybe a skeptic might. But yeah, that was a pretty cool encounter.
Well, we were talking about the other story. Is that the same story where somebody from the Air Force Base shot at the alien?
Yeah. So this is about 10 years before the 1977 encounter. So it might have been 65, 67, something like that. But there was a military police officer on duty, and he was, it was during the winter, and he was by the bomber area, where the jets or planes were. And he saw some shadows kind of like skulking around like behind the planes and by some snowbanks. And so he yelled to whoever it was to like come out and show themselves. And what appeared in front of him were two alien creatures of some sort. And I believe he even aimed his gun at them and was trying to tell them to like stop what they were doing. And he fired off a warning shot to show that he kind of meant business. Well, when that happened, they like disappeared. And then the base came to life. And he's like, what the hell's going on? And then military police converged on him and arrested him, firing a gun while on duty at a base that had nuclear technology on it. So he was essentially kicked out of the military. And he still lived in the area, and he was visiting a bar in the local area one night where some other airmen frequented, and his situation was actually being discussed, and he started overhearing it. So he went over to kind of give them a hard time or whatever. And they were talking about, oh, that's the guy that sees little green men. And when he talked to them, he's like, they're gray, not green. And then he left. I mean, it's anecdotal at best, but a fascinating story.
The fact, the level of where he was in the Air Force, the fact that he shot at them knowing what was at stake, he definitely saw something that scared him.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Nomar, It was great having you on the show. I'm so glad I finally had a chance to redo this interview because I had you on my other show several years ago that never aired. So I was able to ask some questions that from last time and also add some new ones. But before you go, I want to find out what's next. You mentioned you're writing a new book, and where can people find you?
I think the best place to find access to all of my work, which is my podcast and my books, and I make documentaries, is allmylinks.com/Slevik. And that has links to every piece of work that I do. And what's next for me is I'm actually trying my hand at fiction writing. When I say trying my hand at it, that's actually what I've been doing my entire life. My professionally published life has been nonfiction. But behind the scenes, and since I was a kid, I wrote fiction stories and in the realm of horror and sci-fi. So I've been working on a book of short stories that are horror and sci-fi centered, and that'll be coming out next year, the week of Halloween. So I'm pretty excited about that.
All right. Now, are you going to be self-publishing, or do you have your own publisher?
No, I'll be self-publishing that. I've had a lot of dealings with a few different publishers, and this is what I do for a living, and there's time to make money, and then there's time for where distribution is really great. So being with a publisher is really great for distribution. It's not great for making money. So Granite Skies was my first self-published work, and this horror book will be my next self-published work. That's not to say that the publishers I have worked with were terrible by any means. They were absolutely wonderful. They actually wanted to put out Granite Skies, but I walked away from it because there were some things in the contracts we couldn't come to terms with, couldn't agree on. But we left amicably, and they gave their blessing for me to do what I wanted with the Granite Skies book. So while they are wonderful, I'm giving the self-publishing world a try, and so far so good. So I've been pleased.
Who are some of your favorite authors?
Oh boy, there's a lot of favorite authors, but I guess because I'm from Maine, one author that I can never get sick of is Stephen King. I actually drove by his house just yesterday, and I do enjoy Joe Hill's work, which is Stephen King's son.
I love his work,
and also and Mark Danielowski. I really enjoy at least The House of Leaves. That's the only thing of his that I've ever read, and it is utterly fascinating and probably one of my favorite books. As far as horror author goes, I'm also put on the spot, and there's like 10 others that I can't think of, and I'm sitting in a dark room and I can't even read my books right now. Like I can't see. I have a shelf with books and I can't even see them right now.
But anyways, who some of your inspirations were for horror? And Joe Hill, I met Joe Hill several times, and I've read everything he's done. I met Stephen King once, he was doing a speech somewhere, so I didn't actually meet him in person, but I was in the audience. And then I interviewed Owen King, Joe Hill's brother and Stephen King's son, because they wrote a book called, I can't remember what it's called. It was something about sleeping. It was really good, and he was on my other podcast. But yeah, I'm big fans of that. And for other authors, I don't know if you ever heard of Jeff Strand. He's really good.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah. Anyway, you also have your podcast. Let's talk about that. I mentioned it in the intro.
Sure. It's called the I Want to Believe podcast, and it's a short form podcast. Episodes are anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes long, and they cover the gamut in regards to paranormal, and some true crime is thrown in there a little bit here and there, or missing persons, odd missing persons cases. But they are essentially one-off stories about, I cover everything from black-eyed kids to dogmen to haunted lighthouses to UFO encounters, just a ton of different stuff. I typically host it with a buddy of mine named Kyle. Due to COVID, he couldn't be on it with me this year. So this that's about to come out, he's not on that, but I'm going into my 4th season, and what we do is it's a little bit different. I write and edit everything all at once, and then I release everything all at once, kind of like Netflix style, so people can binge listen if they want to an entire season, or they can segregate out however they want. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for I Want to Believe or Nomar Slevik, either way. And yeah, going into the 4th season, and that launches in January of 2021, and I'm super excited about it. There's lots of cool episodes coming up, and yeah, yeah, it's one of it's the biggest labor of love. That is the hardest thing I do, that does not generate any sort of monetary income for me whatsoever. It's just the absolute pure love of telling these stories in an audio manner. I absolutely love doing it.
I went through all the episodes and I loved it. I love it. Another thing I highly recommend: buy his books, listen to his podcasts. You can't go wrong. And
Thanks,
there's
man.
one last thing. I saw an interview you were doing with Bill Brock. I'm not sure if you were a part of this. Did you investigate the Lizzie Borden house?
I did not, no.
It might have been Bill then. He was talking about that.
Yep.
I was just curious because I've been there several times.
Cool.
I've never felt anything, never saw anything, but it's an interesting place. And of course, the history,
Yeah.
killed their parents.
Yeah,
But
fascinating story, fascinating history. And you brought up Bill Brock a couple times. I'm glad you did. I love the guy. And, he's always, doing something new or working with, other people in the field of the paranormal, the Conjuring House people or Stacy Brown Jr. or, a bunch of different people. So shout out to Bill Brock.
very good. Nomar, love to have you on the show. Please come back when your next book comes out. And we'll talk about your fiction.
All right. Awesome. Thanks, man. Had fun.
All right, that wraps up the latest episode of the Claw's Corner. I would like to thank my guest, independent creator, researcher, author, podcaster, and investigator in numerous aspects of the paranormal, Nomar Slevik. I would also like to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in. Enjoy your day, everyone.